of my PowerPoint about interpreting the red ink, how to take paper feedback on board and improve your writing. So these are slides that I created to just walk you through some stuff that I've been seeing in papers as I have been looking at them and giving you feedback. And I recognize that, when you get feedback on a paper, you don't necessarily know how to make sense of it. So I'm hoping that these slides will help you do that, and that me talking you through them in this video will help you be able to kind of absorb the information from the slides better. So bear with me. This is a little bit long, but listen to it as you're driving your car or as you're walking around or whatever works for you. I hope that it's helpful. All right. So slide number 1 is on integrating response dialogue. So sometimes you want to express yours or someone else's response. Do you actually need a quote sandwich dialogue for this? You don't. So here's from a sample paper. My initial response was, quote, "Wow, this is cool," until I walked into the house. But take a look at the revised version of that. I initially thought it was cool until I walked into the house. So think about which of those is more fluid. The second one is more fluid because instead of kind of breaking it up with this unnecessary kind of random quote that's very conversational, it provides a more formal, smooth, fluid integration of the idea of thinking about something rather than kind of putting that thought in as a quote. All right, formatting dialogue. Now, this is something that we have had to do in our HW 101. We haven't done it in 102, but I do think that it's an important lesson to take forward, especially if you end up taking a creative writing class or you want to do any creative writing or even creative nonfiction in your spare time, and that is formatting dialogue. So if you're writing creative nonfiction or fiction, you may need to represent dialogue or the conversation between two or more people, and you need to format that correctly. So instead of it being kind of a continuous thing like you would with regular text that you're writing, you want to go ahead and give each person, as it switches back and forth, a new line. So instead of this first example here, you go ahead and put the response on a new line, and then if your brother said something back, that would go on a new line, and then you said something back, that would go on a new line, and it carries on forward. Now we see this all the time when we're reading, but I'm not sure how much we actually acknowledge that that's what's going on until we have to write it ourselves. So I hope that's helpful. Weird and clunky transition signal phrases. Okay, so my own sort of theory with writing is that if you have your information ordered in a way that makes sense, if you have your paragraphs ordered in a logical, reasonable way, then you don't need those big old transition phrases that sometimes you get taught prior to coming to college. So my favorite example was from a student this semester, and it made me chuckle. The example is, "As goes to show, the goldfish are a metaphor for marginalized people." And it's, to me, sounded for all the world like crotchety old Maine fishermen. "As goes to show, the goldfish are a metaphor for marginal people, and they have been for the last 25 years. So I think, this is obviously kind of like a unique example, but anything that kind of has that clunky transition feel of like, now I've said that, I'm going to say this. Again, if it's in an order that makes sense, those transition phrases are just not as necessary. How to embed questions. So sometimes, again, and this goes back up to integrating response dialogue. It's kind of a really similar sort of situation. You need to embed the active questioning, but you don't need to actually state the question in question format. Again, that comes off as really conversational, and you want it to be smooth and fluid within your sentence for it to be a more academic, formal writing approach. So instead of, I was thinking to myself, where am I going to eat lunch today? You would write, I wondered where I was going to eat lunch today. That embeds the question actually in the sentence. And here's an even more kind of relevant example. Jack Zipes asks, why does Ruth Bodekheimer insist on focusing on a literary history of the fairy tale? Instead of doing that, you might try Jack Zipes questions why Ruth Bodekheimer focuses on the literary history of the fairy tale. All right, so when we move on to quotes and integrating sources, one thing that I have seen some people try to do is to integrate block quotes. And a block quote is when you find yourself quoting more than 3 lines of a text continuously. There is a particular way of formatting that. You indent it twice, boom, boom. It's double spaced, not single spaced. There are no quotation marks. And the period, instead of going on the outside of the in-text citation, goes on the inside. And you usually set it up with a colon like this. So that's how you do it, but should you do it? Now, in fairly short papers, like you'll generally write as an undergrad, it's not always advisable because a lot of block quotes makes it look like you're not processing and synthesizing your source material in a thoughtful way. If you're just kind of dumping in these big swaths of your source material, it just sort of seems like you're like, well, this is what they say, and I guess that's cool. But if you're actually kind of breaking that up and integrating your own words and your own sort of explanation of what's going on, we really get a better sense of whether you understand the material or not. And there are some professors, especially in history, that just don't want you to quote at all. They want you to focus on paraphrasing and summarizing the material. So you've got to be kind of aware of that as well. But there are some times when you're dealing with a text where the wording is just really important and you need to convey that. And in those cases, we do find ourselves quoting, and sometimes we find ourselves needing to use a block quote. So that's how you actually do it. Excuse me. So speaking of quotes, there is the quote bomb. All right, so what is a quote bomb? That's when you're dropping in a quotation from an outside source with no framing language at all. So in this first example, it's just the quote and nothing else with the parenthetical citation. But even the simplest kind of like so-and-so says or so-and-so writes is what I would call framing language. That is something that introduces the quote. And so doing something as simple as saying Terry Windling suggests that if we look, quote, at the blah, 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 provides that kind of framing language. Even better is to kind of break it up, rethink the syntax, put what you can in your own words and just distill it down to the kind of most quotable part of that passage that you want to use. So here we have Terry Windling's approach is largely based on examination of rural French history. In fact, she reminds us of the importance of reading The Grandmother's Tale in this context when she emphasizes that at this time, people of all classes still believed in the existence of werewolves. All right, so kind of a related thing. When you go to introduce a quote, I see this a lot, and I'm not really sure why. It comes from the very good intention of wanting to properly frame the quote, like I've been asking for. But sometimes the writer will introduce a quote with an independent clause plus a comma plus the author's name plus writes/argues plus says and then the quote. And when that happens, what's happening there is a comma splice. So we have this that stands on its own. Laura Tosi examines 3 different modes of rewriting fairy tales. She explains blah, 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 blah. Okay, so that right there is a comma splice. You can just go ahead and put a period there and start a new sentence. Or you can, again, like I said in the last slide, break it up, synthesize, and distill it down to the most quotable part of the slide. And that way you get something like, examining 3 different modes of rewriting fairy tales, Laura Tosi explains that these contemporary retellings often, quote, challenge the conservative norms of social behavior and the implication of gender roles in fairy tales. Easy, right? Not always. All right, here's a good one. Always refer to the author or critic or scholar or folklorist or whoever you're dealing with by their first and last name to start with, and then subsequently by their last name. Never refer to them just by their first name. And sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes I know that this happens because they have two names that sound both like last names, or 2 names that both sound like first names. So like Rick Glenn, for example, you might get confused about what the last name is there, or Lewis Thomas, who is somebody who we dealt with in 102 this semester. Make sure you double check what the last name is so that you can go ahead and use that after you've used the full name once. If you don't do that, what happens is that you get a sentence where it sounds like you and that author, critic, or scholar are like BFFs. Like Jack argues that fairy tales represent class struggle, like you guys hang out in the afternoon. Well, it might be entertaining to hang out with Jack Sipes. I still don't think you'd ever want to call him Jack. All right. Exclamation points. Oh my goodness. Sweet baby Jesus and the angels. Why do I see so many exclamation marks? They serve a purpose. I know they do. But for academic writing, for formal academic writing, even if you're doing something like a personal narrative, which we did in 101 this semester, just keep them to a minimum. So for example, we have the summer of 2017, my school and I did a mission trip to Guatemala. It was amazing. We met so many nice people. I couldn't wait to come back and tell all my friends about it. It's just, again, very conversational. It doesn't feel like it has a place in a piece of analysis. Here we have another example. Jack Sipes describes how fairy tales were feminized in order to render them less powerful to influence people, as if being a woman was a negative thing. Imagine that! The thing is that, you know what? If you are an exclamation point kind of person, maybe you just do a draft where you do a bunch of exclamation points because you're excited about whatever it is that you're talking about, and then when you do the revised draft, you take them out. And I think another thing to kind of keep in mind here is that I don't want to quash your voice. I do want your individual voice to come out, but exclamation points kind of are an overly easy, kind of like a lazy way of doing that. So let your voice take flight without relying on stuff like exclamation points. All right. Introductory phrase and subject consistency. Now we're getting into some grammatical issues. So I see this a lot. If your introductory phrase implies a specific subject, do not use a totally different subject when you actually embark on the main part of your sentence. So here's an example. By providing this example, we see a change in society that focuses on the ignorance of what other people might think of the pond. In this example, we see that the we that's provided, when we read around that we in the paper, we realize that they're referring to Lewis Thomas, but in this sentence, it implies that it's the we that are providing the example. And so we want to make sure that the subject of that introductory phrase and the subject of your sentence, excuse me, match up. So here's a better version of that. By providing this example, Lewis Thomas shows us a change in society, blah, 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 blah. All right. Do your bits mix. So Here, I want you to think about whether the parts of your sentence mesh grammatically when excess language is trimmed away. And this is really similar to the previous slide, but it has to do with the main body of the sentence. So take this example. Einar highlights that things that society thinks are actually a perfectly fine way to live. Now, I can see how reading that out loud, you might not even catch it, but when you strip away the other bits, the excess bits, we see that it's things is supposed to match up with a perfectly fine way to live. Things are a perfectly fine way to live. And those things don't match up. We can't, it just doesn't make sense that things are a perfectly fine way to live. Now, we might try to do something like Einar highlights modes of living that society approves. The fact of the matter is, when I tried to revise the sentence, I wasn't really sure what the writer was trying to do. That the writer was trying to communicate. Whoops. But there you have it. So that's why we have face-to-face appointments in the Writing Center, and why you and I work one-to-one, so that if there are places where communication breaks down, we can figure out what you tried to mean together. So embracing consistency is a major theme I want to explore in this PowerPoint. And this is one of the number one kinds of things that I see when I read papers. And what separates people who are generally earning higher grades on papers from folks who are still struggling is consistency. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that in papers where there's a lack of consistency, it just looks really sloppy and unrevised, probably because it is unrevised. And that's why I build the process of writing the paper into everything that we do. So, for example, if you capitalize a word above, why have it lowercase later on? If you use a present tense above, why have it past tense below? If you use the correct spacing and punctuation above, why is it suddenly janky and all over the place? If most of your paragraphs generally tend to be 10 to 15 lines long, why do you suddenly have a paragraph that's 3 lines long or 30 lines long? These kinds of inconsistencies stand out to a reader, especially one that's looking critically at your paper. And like I said, it makes it look sloppy, and that is not what you want your reader to think about your work. So this is why we take the time and we do at least one read through of your paper before you turn it in to your professor, so that you can catch some of this stuff. Preferably you do more than one read through, but a girl can dream. All right. Capitalization, speaking of consistency. When do you capitalize a word? In general, it's at the beginning of a sentence. And if they're proper nouns, and if you're in doubt about whether you're dealing with a proper noun, look it up on the internet. There is some inconsistency between MLA and APA, so that in MLA, if you're presenting a title of a book or an article, you would capitalize all the major words. Okay? In APA, however, you'd only capitalize the first word and then any proper nouns in the rest of the title. So that's fun. Thanks, APA. All right, and spacing. Now, spacing is one of those things that I don't get why I see problems with it, because this is kind of one of those things, like on the other side of all of this, a thing seems so easy just because it's become second nature to me. And that's how I want it to become for you too. Like, I don't ever want you to be writing and just think like, that looks fine, that there's a space between the S and the comma, because it doesn't. It screams like, no, don't do it. No, don't do it. So just make sure that as you're typing, it becomes habitual to have no space between the word and the punctuation, and then a space afterwards. Okay. Even your typing machine doesn't want you to do it, because look what happens when you have the space here, the comma, and then no space between before the quotation mark. The quotation mark is actually going the wrong way. It's pointing to the left instead of to the right. So you're getting cues from the universe and your machine that this isn't the thing to do. So I know that this seems like really fiddly stuff, but visually for a reader, it makes a big difference. And again, if it's not right, it looks sloppy. Oh, this topic makes me feel so tense. Different disciplines call for different use of tenses when referring to sources. In English classes, we generally ask that you refer to sources in the present tense, no matter when they were published or if the author is alive. But be aware that other disciplines may have different conventions, so always ask your professor and clarify that. So for my class, whether you're talking about the action that happens in a tale, like the Silky slithers into the ocean, or you're talking about a writer who's talking about tales, at least for my 102 class, this is the material we're dealing with, you would always use the present tense. So Marina Warner explains blah, 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 not explained blah, blah, blah. Okay. And then all the action that happens, like I said, in the text, you should just think of it as always happening, like it's published there. It's always going on. But there are notable exceptions. So if you're talking about something that has a distinct fixed point in time, that is a historical event, you're going to talk about it in the past tense. So Jack Sipes delivered an iconic address to the students of Harvard University in 1973, blah, 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 blah. Okay. All right, a little jot down the comma lane, and just a brief little expedition into grammar territory. So some common commas, say that 5 times fast, after an introductory phrase in the middle of a sentence to set off non-essential clauses, phrases, or words. That is, things that you could take out of the sentence and it would not change the meaning dramatically. Or to join 2 independent clauses with a coordinating conjunction so that you avoid a comma splice, or to compose a list. Those are the 4 major ways that we use commas. So some starter words that signal that you are in fact composing an introductory phrase are things like after, although, as, because, if, since, when, while. So if you find yourself starting a sentence with one of those words, you're probably doing an introductory phrase and you probably need a comma after it. So while she's kind of a snob, comma, she's still my best friend. All right, moving on to the next example or the next type, non-essential clauses, phrases, and words. So my example is those tomatoes, which I picked from my garden, are called sweet 100s. If I took out that phrase, it wouldn't dramatically change the sentence. It would still convey the majority of the information. And so I set that off with commas. Now, if it is information that is necessary, that is essential, then we don't set it off with commas. All right, next type, 2 independent clauses combined with a comma and a coordinating conjunction like and, if, but, or, nor. This is how we avoid the comma splice. We want to avoid the comma splice at all costs. So example, I picked up the scissors, comma, and I cut some pictures out of a magazine. Dun, dun, dun. All right, and of course lists. You guys know this. I went to the store and returned with milk, comma, eggs, comma, and cheese. Don't mind me, I'm just dying of the common cold over here. All right, one more comma slide about unnecessary commas. Commas, friends, commas are not like breadcrumbs that you fling across the path of your sentences to find your way home. They are rules. And although the pause test isn't 100, do you guys know what the pause test is? That is like, if you pause in a sentence, that's where a comma goes. It's not 100% effective. It might not even be 80% effective, to be honest, but it is a place to start. And I think you can see that in these two real examples from a student paper, um, where if you pause, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. Furthermore, the narrator was forced to inhabit the skill of dumpster diving, comma, in order to stay as healthy and safe as possible. And then then there were the standard pleasantries with, comma, police, doormen, bouncers, cabs. Now, I think what's probably happening with this comma is that there's supposed to be a quotation mark here, because there's a quotation mark here, and the quote's got to start somewhere. But even if that was the case, you wouldn't need a comma there. Why? Because we don't have that kind of setup that requires one. We could take that out, put the quote in, and it would be just fine. It's only if we're setting it up like Staples writes, comma, and then we do a complete sentence quote, that we need that comma there. All right, enough about commas. Commas. All right, so this is the last slide. Not that there's not more things that I could say, and I'll probably have to do a follow-up presentation at some point with some additional points as I read more of your papers, but this is a particular pet peeve of mine, so I'm going to end on this note to avoid superficial evaluative comments. I can't stand them. They make me recoil. They make me cringe. And do you want to know why? It's because they are a waste of space and they say nothing useful. You're not writing a food review. No offense to food reviews. They are important in the world. And actually, I think a good food review wouldn't even do this. You're analyzing a text. So, no, is Jack Zipes does a great job talking about class structure in fairy tales. I'm dying over here, and it's not just the cold. Or Jack Zipes' discussion of class structure is really interesting. Oh, all right. So you see, like, you're not doing anything. You're just kind of patting him on the head and not giving us any sense of what is so great about it or why it's interesting. Even if you follow up with a sentence where you do that, you've already wasted this space where you could have just said that already. All right, so instead, try something like Jack Zipes explains how class hierarchies are at the heart of the fairy tale structure. That does something, that tells us something. And if you must give the man or the woman who you're writing about praise, then try something like this. Jack Zipes offers a compelling perspective on class structure in fairy tales when he analyzes the unequal relation between the miller's daughter and the king in Rumpelstiltskin. Embed that kind of, head patting into a sentence that actually says something about why it's compelling. So please avoid that. If you leave my class doing nothing else, please avoid doing these superficial evaluative comments. They drive me crazy. All right, folks, there you have it, my narration of this lovely PowerPoint slide, take two, because the first one didn't work. And if this one doesn't work, I may just curl up into a ball and die. So have a great weekend. Celebrate Martha Berry and her wonderful life. Enjoy yourselves, and I will see you on Monday. Bye.